Hello! Welcome to Reliability and Validity. Reliability and validity are two terms that often come up in any science, including the science of psychology. They're particularly important when we're talking about measuring something, and scientists measure all kinds of things. Psychological scientists measure behaviors, thoughts, and feelings, and we can be very particular about the reliability and validity of those measures. Let's begin by understanding a definition of reliability: the repeatability of a measure. We can also think of it as the consistency with which a measurement is made. And an example might help us. Let's assume for the moment that we are health psychologists, and we're very interested in helping people maintain a healthy body weight. We might use as one of our instruments a simple bathroom scale that registers either in pounds or in kilograms a person's weight. We would expect that if this bathroom scale had high reliability, we could invite somebody to stand on it, take their weight, stand off of it just for a second or two, and then return again to stand on the bathroom scale and do this several times in a row. Generally speaking, if we have high reliability, we should get ideally exactly the same weight, or nearly so, after these repeated measures of body weight as indexed by the bathroom scale. You can imagine that no scale that's ever been created for measuring anything has perfect reliability, but reliability can exist in various gradations. Let's take another example. Let's pretend we're sports psychologists and we're interested in the reliability of a particular participant's responses on a dart throwing test. Here we have a green and white target, and it's being intercepted by this red dart that is perfectly thrown. We can ask the person who threw this dart to throw it again and again and again, and if this were an expert dart thrower, you might imagine that most of the darts would land right around this red central area. Somebody who's a little bit less skilled might have the darts spread out a little bit more, and you might notice that as the person is getting more and more toward the novice end of the spectrum, we would get wider and wider and wider circles. So one of the ways of thinking about reliability is how much spread there is in the repeated measures of a particular construct. Here we're measuring dart throwing. If we have very, very high levels of reliability, we would have a very small standard deviation. That is to say that any given observation deviates only a little bit from its mean. If we have much less reliability, then the repeated measures would have a much larger spread around the mean score. And so it goes with any number of psychological constructs. Psychologists might be interested in measuring personality, for example. Here, they wouldn't be using a physical measure like a dartboard or a scale, but they might use a survey. If we had a personality survey that had high reliability, we would expect that if we gave the same person the personality test several times in a row, within a very brief interval of time, one after the next, we would expect to see repeated measures being very consistent across time. And to the extent that that is true, we have high reliability. Let's now contrast reliability with validity and recognize that there are actually different types of validity. In this video, we're only going to address two types of validity: internal validity and external validity. But if you take advanced courses, you'll see that there are many, many different flavors of validity. So let's first begin by understanding internal validity, the extent to which researchers measure what they claim to be measuring. One other example will help us. Let's pretend now that we are cognitive psychologists, and we're very interested in measuring intelligence. We want to develop some kind of intelligence test, and we can ask about the internal validity of the intelligence test. That might have many questions. Let's say that some of our questions address the topic of polo, which is shown here in this diagram. Well, it might be that if the questions ask about very specific facts that pertain to polo, only a very small number of people could answer that question correctly. And the people who can answer correctly might just happen to have special knowledge of polo, independent of their intelligence. So if we use polo-specific questions to answer or address the issue of intelligence, we probably have a breach of internal validity. We're not measuring what we claim to be measuring. An important point to note is that our internal validity is completely independent from our reliability, as we saw in the last slide. So remember that reliability is the consistency of a measure. So we could, for example, have a small sample of folks, some of whom might score consistently very well on our polo questions. Others might perform consistently very poorly on our Polo questions. So now we have reliability, but still we have the issue of whether the Polo questions are addressing the construct we want to address, which is, in this case, intelligence. So the idea of validity, in this case internal validity, and reliability are in fact distinct ideas. You could have one without having the other. Something that the two constructs have in common, though, is that both can exist in gradations. That is, we can have internal validity to varying degrees, just like we can have reliability in varying degrees. Let's now contrast internal validity with external validity. We can define that as the generalizability of a finding to novel conditions. And by novel conditions, we can mean a range of things. Novel conditions might include novel stimulation or novel tasks, novel situations, novel environments, novel populations. A picture here will again say 1,000 words for us. As psychologists, we might be interested in measuring behaviors, thoughts, and feelings, and typically we will make those measurements in a particular culture, maybe the culture depicted in this diagram. We can then ask the question, to what extent do our findings there generalize to a different culture and a different culture still? All three of these seem to be very different cultures from each other, but they're all modern cultures. We can ask other questions. Do behaviors, thoughts, and feelings from different times in human history or in animal history more generally, do those findings generalize to modern times and vice versa? Do we get generalizability across cultures, across time? Do we have generalizability across species? Down in the lower right-hand portion of this diagram, we can see that we have, in fact, a broad range of life forms. We can ask to what extent does a particular finding generalize across these very, very different life forms. We can limit our scope, as psychologists often do, to the kingdom of animals. And here I'll now zoom in, and we can even see that among animals we have a very diverse range of species. And the external validity question here, again, would be, to what extent does a finding obtained for one species generalize to all these different species? An interesting question is, once again, we can recognize that external validity, just like internal validity, and just like reliability, can exist in gradations. We can ask the question, to what extent do we have external validity? Additionally, we can ask the question, in what ways do we have external validity? Or in what ways do we have internal validity? Or in what ways do we have reliability? So we can set up a quantitative question by invoking the prepositional phrase, to what extent. For example, to what extent do we have internal validity, external validity, reliability? We can set up a qualitative analysis by posing the prepositional phrase, in what ways do we have external validity or internal validity or reliability? Thanks for watching.